Okay, good. All right, let's see what we can accomplish in the last hour and 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to start by talking about the sort of the trade and task model, and then I'm going to give you some evidence on outsourcing and trade and tasks, and then I'm going to the last two things I hope to talk about beyond that. So first I'm going to talk about Grossman and Rossi-Hansberg. Then I'm going to talk about this paper by Lindsay Oldensky, which is a working paper. It's the AR paper. Then I will talk about the, hopefully I'll talk about Desan and Santos in the JPE. This paper is called Adaptive Organizations. And then for fun, if there's time, I'll talk about the Otter and Dorn 2009 age structure paper, which appears in the papers and proceedings. Okay. But let's start. I want to start with the paper I've been advertising, which is this Grossman-Rossi-Hansberg paper. And so the idea here is, so I'm going to work through some of the model. I'm going to try, there's a lot that one could do, and if you download my lecture notes, you'll find that a lot of it is derived in the lecture notes, but I won't derive it all here. We're going to go back to our trade type model, and we're going to have two goods in the home country. These goods are X and Y, where X is the skill-intensive good. All right. So this is going to be again a two-sector, two-factor type trade model, right? And we're going to have H and L, which are high and low skill labor, right? So I'll just say H and L. So why don't I just say labor? Okay. And we're going to have an economy trading with the rest of the world, producing these two different types of goods, and just to fix ideas, let's do the following. Let's say that the way we know that this is the high and low skill labor is let's make these the unit labor requirements. So AHX ALX greater than AHY ALY. Okay, so what is A? A is the unit labor requirements to produce 1 unit of output of good X or Y, right, at given factor prices. And so the fact that this inequality just means that for any given factor prices, the X good demands relatively more high than low skill labor than the Y good, right? So this is just like what we were working with yesterday. And now what we're going to do, or what they're going to do, is we're going to assume what they want to do is they want to model the kind of breakdown of production processes across countries. And so they're going to assume that there's in each sector, for each type of labor, there's a continuum of tasks, which is of measure 1. Right? So each type of labor does 1 unit of tasks. So in other words, you can think of these AH, AL, in both these sides as multiplying, so that amount of labor is used to perform a unit of task to produce a unit of output. And we can normalize those as 1 because that's harmless. And but it could be, for example, but clearly if the X good uses more high skill tasks than the Y good, right? We're multiplying both by 1, but this A will be larger. We're going to think of these tasks as of all being of the same width, right? So you can have a continuum of tasks, and each one of them is of sort of equal size. Again, that's probably harmless because you can always redefine a task to be wider or narrower. And so we're going to have these tasks, and each task in a sector 4 skill group is going to be on this interval 0, 1. And we're going to think of these tasks as being organized in order of their routineness. Right? So tasks at the low end of that interval are the most routine, and tasks at the high end of that interval are the least routine. Okay, that's their terminology. I don't know where they got the inspiration. And something else on that. Oh yeah, okay, right. Key assumption. Every one of these tasks, right, and this is like a kind of a critical assumption that's not adequately stressed by the paper, is that these tasks, so tasks I in this interval are perfect complements. Okay? So in other words, all of the tasks in a continuum in a sector need to be performed to produce output, right? They're completely indivisible, or when I say indivisible, they can be done elsewhere, but you have to do every single one of them to produce a unit of the good, okay? That's an extremely important assumption, right? Because there's no substitutability among these tasks, okay? This is like an O-ring, exactly, that's right. And so that's exactly right. And the other thing is that, so if we have L workers, right, they're doing these L tasks, right, but basically, essentially, all L workers are perfect substitutes across tasks, right, and similarly, and also similarly for H workers, right? So in other words, if L workers do these tasks, although the tasks differ in their degree of routineness, right? But all L workers perform them equally well, so there's no notion of some L workers are better at the more routine tasks and some are better at the less routine tasks. All the tasks need to be done, they're perfectly complementary. So they're distinctive in their quality, but they're perfectly complementary in their productivity, and then there's perfect substitutability of workers' skills within a skill group L or H across tasks. So those are a pretty extreme set of assumptions, okay? And I think so you need to be clear on that. Okay. So now the question is, we want to think about outsourcing in this model. So outsourcing, the way outsourcing is going to look in this model is is that they're going to be the tasks that are more routine are going to be easier to outsource, right? All else equal. So let's assume we can think in some sense of outsourcing as making use of a foreign technology. Right, and this technology can be expressed by. So let's say if producing a unit of the low-skilled task in the Y industry takes, let's see, if it takes LY in the domestic industry, right, then it's going to take, or let's say for a specific task, takes this much, right? Then if it's produced overseas, it's going to take beta greater than 1, so beta ALY for the same task done if you offshore it, right? So in other words, domestic workers have an absolute advantage in all tasks, right? Because they actually maybe I should make a T on that. Why don't I call that T? So I'll put this T, okay? And so if it's done domestically, it takes this much labor. If it's done through offshoring, it takes more labor. Okay, and we're going to assume that let's have T prime I greater than 0 for all I, meaning that the comparative disadvantage of international workers, right, is increasing in the non-routineness of the task, right? So in other words, if it takes 20% more labor to do the least routine task, it takes 80% more labor to do the most non-routine task. Okay. Now, of course, so why would anyone outsource? Well, of course, the reason you would outsource is wage. There'd be a wage differential, right? So let's assume that let's call W is the domestic wage. right? And let's say W star is the foreign wage, right, with two things. So first of all, W is greater than W star, and more importantly, or as importantly, W is greater than B times beta times T of 0 times W star. Okay? So what that expression means is that the lowest, the most routine task can be performed internationally at a lower cost than it can be performed domestically. Okay? Is that clear? So what that means is and then of course, there's going to be a crossing point, right? Or at least it's useful to think of there being a crossing point. So there's going to be some intermediate task I, right, where WT0, apologize, right, is greater than, so the cost of doing task 0 domestically, greater than the cost of doing task 0 through offshoring, right? There's going to be some crossing point R where W of Ti is equal to beta times Ti times W star, right? So that's the marginal task, right? So tasks that are more complex than I, right, will be done domestically, and tasks that are less complex than I can be offshored, right? Clear on the notation here? Okay, good. Now, okay, so we need so to proceed on this, we need a couple more ideas or assumptions. So first of all, we want to ask, is this, when we think about this outsourcing, we can think of it as having a sector bias or a factor bias, right? So a sector bias would mean that it's more applicable in X than Y, or vice versa. A factor bias would be that it's more applicable to L than H, for example, right? So hard to know how to proceed on that. The way, I think they take a reasonable first starting point, which is that they're going to say, let's start with a case where only the L tasks can be offshored, right? So H tasks are not going to be offshore, they're going to be performed domestically. L tasks are going to be offshoreable, but conditional on that, there's no L tasks in the Y good are no more or less offshoreable than L tasks in the X good, right? So both sectors can equally take advantage of this offshoreability, although of course remember that the that the Y sector is more L intensive, right? So it in some sense has greater opportunity to take advantage of this technology, right? So you can think of this beta as being a kind of a technology, right, for taking your routine tasks and doing them more cheaply elsewhere, right? And so in this model, as we're doing it, right, beta is exogenous, as is W star, right? It's not being competed up or down, right, by firms' outsourcing decisions or offshoring decisions, right? It's just out there, right? Okay, good. Now, anything else I want to say about that? Okay, I guess not. Okay, so now let's go to the next step of this. So let's assume that goods are produced competitively, right? So which means that price is going to equal marginal cost, and we're going to have constant returns to scale technology, which means they're also going to equal average cost. Okay? So okay, so I said this marginal task is I, right? So now what's we're going to have? The cost of the price of good J, right, is going to be less than or equal to W times A LJ. Is this right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Good. Times 1 minus I plus W star times A Lj times the integral from 0 to I of beta Ti di plus S of S of AHJ. Then we might have other factors. Let me come back to that in 1 second. And this is for J is equal to X or Y. Okay, so let me be clear what that is. Okay, so it says the price of good J, right, where J is either good X or good Y, right, is going to be the cost of the labor inputs done at home. And notice, right, it's A is the total amount of low-skill task that must be done, right, of low-skill labor that must be used. But only 1 minus I of that is going to be done domestically, right? So I is a number on the open interval between 0 and 1, right? So, you know, let's say you're outsourcing 20% of your tasks, right? So you're going to use 80% of the labor domestically. And then you're going to take the cost of this task done on the international market, or done through offshoring, right? So the cost is integral from 0 to I, so this might be 0.2, right? Beta times the cost of doing that task, right? And the marginal task, the last task, of course, costs exactly the same done abroad or done at home, but all the inframarginal tasks, right, cost less. Right? And then there's this is your skilled unit labor requirements, right? And we're assuming there's nothing interesting happening on there. And the reason I put these, the reason Rossi Hansberg and Grossman put the kind of open paren there is to stress that these unit input requirements are endogenous, right? Obviously, like when we did this yesterday, when we worked with the learner diagrams, remember that as the wage ratio shifted in the economy, firms moved along their ISO cost curves or ISO value curves to change their unit input requirements of HRL labor as a function of the relative wages that they faced. Right? So you can think of these things as adjusting as wages adjust, although we don't have to model that at the moment, right? But of course, this condition will hold at any level of wages, right? Because the X good is more high skill intensive than the L good, right? Okay, good. All right, so now we want to sort of unpack this a little bit more. Let's see. Can everybody see if I write over here? Is there another light for this part of the world? Okay. Oh, I guess it was already on. Okay. All right. Oh yeah, that's better. Very good. Okay. Okay. So let's see. So it's useful to define the following. This omega I is going to be equal to 1 minus I plus the integral from 0 to I of beta times Ti di over Ti. Okay? And once you write that omega, you can rewrite this equation over here. So let me call this equation, I'm just going to call this equation 1. So now I'm going to rewrite equation 1 prime. I'm going to say that P is Pj less than or equal to W times A Lj open paren omega I plus S A Hj blah blah blah, and then for J is equal to X or Y. Okay, so what have I done here? So the usefulness of this substitution is it allows me to re-express my total labor costs in terms of the wages of domestic workers, right? So I now have rescaled, right, instead of expressing this in terms of the wages of domestic workers and the wages of foreign workers, right, I've just developed an expression that essentially, through this optimal choice of I, allows me to express my labor costs as basically in proportion to my original cost if I had done this domestically, right? So clearly this omega thing is going to be, omega I is going to be less than 1. Right? So if I'm, if it's if it's 0.2, then clearly the maximum amount of savings I could get is 20% of labor costs if I could offshore it for free, right? But clearly that wouldn't be the case, right? So it's going to be some fraction of my total labor costs. Okay, and let's see. Is there anything interesting to say about that? Okay, so. All right, so that is that's the kind of the partial equilibrium equation, right, for how an industry would choose the degree of outsourcing and what it would do to its short-term input costs, right? So then the question is, well, how does this play out in equilibrium, right? So how is this this change in unit input costs going to affect the wages of high and low skill workers, right? So how is this going to affect WL? How is this going to affect WH, right? Well, there are several things that need to happen to make this work. First of all, of course, we're going to have freeing of L labor, right? We're going to have extra L labor that's freed from both sectors, right, as we substitute offshored workers. Right? That's one thing. So that freeing of labor is going to have to equilibrate through either changes in wages or changes in quantities of output. Right? We're also going to have changes in the marginal productivity of labor, right, reflecting the complementarity among tasks. Right, and I'll come back to that in 1 second. And then of course we have to have so I said equilibrium in the labor market. We have to have changes in wages reflecting changes in marginal products, and then we may have to have re-equilibration across sectors in response to changing marginal products, which change wages, which change prices. Okay, so a lot of things could happen. But one thing we know for sure, for market clearing, it needs to be the case that A times, oh yeah, good. So A times LXX plus A times, A times LYY is going to be equal to L over 1 minus I, right? So in other words, the total amount of domestic low-skilled labor used in the X and Y sectors, right, must come to the initial endowment scaled up by the amount of labor that we've freed, right, by offshoring. And A times HXX plus A times HY Y, it's going to still be equal to H. Okay? So we have excess labor in low-skill activities, but we don't have any change in labor in high-skill activities, because for the moment we've assumed that all the offshoring is going on in low-skill activities, right? Okay. So now we want to ask the following question: how is the market going to re-equilibrate? And here's where I'm going to just sort of write down the answers rather than solving them, because this would be a lot of pages of algebra to get here. So let me solve them, and then let me just tell you what you would do, and then let me talk about what they mean. Okay, so there are going to be 4 equilibrium equations. So let's normalize, right, that Px is equal to 1, right? So this is the price of the high-skill good, right? So then Py will be endogenous, okay? So we have the following. We have P is going to equal, so Px is equal to 1, so then P is going to be equal to Py. So if I forget and just write P, I mean Py. Okay? All right. Py is going to be equal to W times A times L of Ly times this dependency omega I, right, plus S times a HY dependency. Okay, then we're going to have 1, which is the price of the X good, right, is going to be equal to W times A L Lx times omega I. Right, so again, both sectors are taking advantage of this offshoring, right? Plus S AHX, right? Or maybe that's a little AHX, right? Second of all, we have to have L is equal to 1 minus I times AL XX. Plus 1 minus I times ALY, LXX, yep. Right? And then finally, H is equal to AHX times X plus AHY times Y. Okay, so these are the 4 equilibrium conditions of this model, right? So we have a model for prices, right? We have a model for labor supply, and of course these wages have to be adjusting so that these wages you could think of as the endogenous parameters, right? The wages and the factor shares, I guess, or factor intensities, such that when we're all done shifting stuff around, these prices hold with equality and there's no spare labor, right? Okay. So now you can take this and totally differentiate it, okay? And you're going to get the following. You're going to get W hat, which is basically the logarithmic change in W, which is the wage of low-skilled workers, right, is going to be equal to minus omega hat, right, which is the change in this outsourcing term, right, plus mu1 times P hat, which refers to changes in the price of the Y good, plus mu2 times DI over 1 minus I. Okay. I'm not defining these mu terms. Let's talk about these in turn, okay? Because these represent 3 different channels by which trade, or which this offshoring process might affect the wages of low-skilled workers, okay? So first of all, let's take them in reversed order, okay? This is DII. This is the amount of labor that's being freed for the marginal offshoring, right? So for example, think of a decline in beta. Right? So decline in beta means some kind of technological change that makes it easier for us to offshore tasks. Right? So if we have a decline in beta, right, that's going to have the effect of moving the outsourcing margin out, right? So it's going to raise this equilibrium, this crossing point I, this threshold, right? So that's going to have the effect of freeing labor, right? And we have to be, and that gets scaled by the initial amount of labor that we were already using, right? And so this is and then U2 is essentially the multiplier on that tells us how much the change in effective low-skilled labor supply changes the wage of low-skilled workers domestically. Okay, so now ask yourself, so imagine that this is a small open economy, okay, that's experiencing unilateral changes in its ability to offshore, right? So imagine, for example, this is Hong Kong, right? And all of a sudden, beta has fallen because, Hu Jintao has said beta is now lower. But it's a small open economy, so it actually it's going to be it doesn't affect world markets, right? Let's assume to a first approximation. So what's this U2 term going to be in that case? Well, the answer can't be complicated, right? Or else I wouldn't ask you for it without. But okay, well, think about it, right? Remember, go back to the Lerner diagram, right? If you're a small open economy, then world prices are parametric, right? So the reason that labor supply, changes in labor supply affect wages in an open economy is if changes in labor supply affects goods output, which then affects world relative price of goods because you create more or less of something, right? So clearly, if we're freeing low-skilled labor, right, we're going to tend to produce more of the low-skilled good, right, to absorb that labor, right? So if we're freeing so if we're freeing L, right, and we have two sectors that are, they have different degrees of demand for L, right? It's like this is an expansion of our endowment of L, right? So if you go back to our previous box, right, where we had the sort of the, let's see, if we go back to this thing, right? So we had. So we are initially, so let's say, this is our, actually let's start with a square, more or less, okay? So this is our endowment of L, this is our endowment of H, right? This is the, let's say, this is the X sector, this is the Y sector, right? This is the output expansion path of the X sector. Notice that it's L intensive, right? So that slope is less than 1. Right? And now let's look at the output expansion path of the Y sector, right? And its slope is greater than 1, right? So when we look at this equilibrium, right? So, right, here is L to X, low-skilled labor going to the X good. Here's high-skilled labor going to the X good, right? Here's high-skilled labor going to the Y good. Here's low-skilled labor going to the Y good. Right? Okay, so now when this term here refers to basically an expansion of this box, right? Because the effective supply of low-skilled labor is now larger because we're using less low-skilled labor per unit output because we're offshoring some of it, right? So you can think of this as being just an expansion of this box, right? Now, holding all wages constant, right, what we can do is we can just continue this line here, right, redraw this line from the origin, right, and now, clearly, we've reallocated and we're going to be producing relatively more of the X good than the Y good than we were previously, right? So to soak up the extra L, right, we have to produce more of relatively more of the output of the thing that's L intensive. Right now we're going to produce more of both, right? But relatively we're going to produce more output of L. Now if we were not a price taker on world markets, right, if we move markets, this would have the effect of depressing the price of the X good, right? But if we're a small open economy, right, then this term would be equal to 0. Right? So if we're a small open economy, right, there's no, the labor reallocation is handled by changes in relative sector sizes, but if prices are parametric, no change in wages, right? At least no change in wages accruing through that channel.
Like
That's right. This is the Rybczynski theorem, exactly. Similarly, right, again, by the same argument, right, there would be this p hat term would also be 0 for the same reason, right? Now normally this p hat is occurring because of this thing, right? But in this model there's actually two separate channels, right? Because there's the pure labor reallocation and the other is the whatever technological phenomenon might also move p hat. Okay, so again, for a small open economy, these two terms would be 0, right? Okay, so now let's look at this term. Okay, well what's the sign of d omega d beta? Right? So omega, right, is basically this outsourcing term, right? And this thing is declining in beta, right? So the higher is beta, the less we offshore, right? The less foreign labor we use, right? And so this is going to be less than 0, right? So if we imagine a decline in beta, right, a fall in offshoring costs, right, then this is negative, right? So reverse that sign. No. D omega d beta. No, that can't be right. D omega. So this thing is. So beta is higher. This is smaller when beta is lower, right? So when beta is lower, this is smaller because it's a reduction in cost. So I apologize. right? So this says, this is a sort of a measure of our cost savings, right? So when beta is higher, our cost savings, sorry, it's a measure of our effective costs, excuse me. So when beta is higher, our effective costs are higher, right? When beta is lower, our effective cost is lower. So if you imagine, imagine now, let's imagine that beta is falling, right? So offshoring costs are falling. So that means that d omega d minus beta is going to be less than 0, and that enters here positively, right? So this net term, right, this says that basically if, so this would be positive for beta declining, right? So this says that essentially dw d beta is equal to minus omega, which is greater than 0, right? So in other words, this says that offshoring raises the wage of low-skilled labor, right? Now, why is that true? Okay, why is that true? Terrell, is everyone clear on the mechanics here? Right? That we have this. Again, I'm not going to go through the whole model, but basically you can think of, you can decompose any effect on low-skilled wages into 3 components, right? One coming from change in, excess labor supply, which is 0 in a small open economy. 2 is from change in the world prices of the good, also 0 in a small open economy. And the third is from this change in unit labor requirements. Okay, and here we're saying that as offshoring increases, the wages of low-skilled labor will be rising in offshoring. Okay, why is that so? Okay, the reason, what's actually going on here, right, and here's where you can see the sort of the mapping between assumption and result, is we've said that all of these tasks, these low-skilled tasks, or all the tasks in an interval, are perfectly complementary. Right? If one is produced, then the other one has to be produced to produce output, right? So clearly, when the cost of performing some of these tasks falls, right, we're going to want to do more of them, right? That means that it means the demand for the remaining tasks is rising, right? But of course, all L workers are perfect substitutes among those tasks. They don't mind that they have to do less routine tasks, right? They just do that. They're equally productive at that. So this is effectively like a technological change that allows a given L worker to produce more output with the same input, right? What they're doing, it's not a technology, it's trade. They're basically buying a part of their work from someone else who does it cheaper, right? But this is like, the old standard idea of, trade is something that, allows you to take wheat, take wheat to the port and convert it into, automobiles, right? It's a technology for taking one input and turning into, or taking one good and turning into another good, right? Well, that's the same idea that's captured here. Is what you're doing is it's as if these low-skilled workers are taking a piece of their job, paying someone else to do it for less than it would cost them to do it, right? And then capturing the residual profit, right? And that's raising their wage. Okay, so that's the idea. Now so let's talk a few things. First of all, let me show you how you would do this in the learner diagram that we talked about yesterday. Okay, so here is so here is L and here is H, right? And here are your ISO value curves for, so this would be H0, H0, and this is, excuse me, this should not be this should be X0, right? X0, and this is going to be Y0, Y0, right? And then we're going to have some initial wage ratio, right? So I do better without the overheads. Right, so this is basically, this intersection is basically 1 over WL, right? And this intersection here is 1 over WH, right? So anything that brings this closer to the origin, right, corresponds to a higher WL, higher WH. Okay. So normally, when we thought about trade between countries, right, we thought about how did it work? Well, you might think of it as shifting the value of these curves, right? So if, for example, something that raised the price of the low skill good, right, would move this towards the origin. Something that raised the price of the high skill good would move this towards the origin, right? And now what's happening in this example? Well, this is equivalent to an inward shift in these isovalue curves, right, that comes from the fact that you can produce more good of the same world price while using fewer inputs, right? So you can think of this as essentially looking like an inward shift plus rotation that's going to look, if I can get this exactly right. Okay, so actually let me draw these first. So these are your old output expansion paths, right? And I'm going to have, sorry, I can see that's not going to work. Okay, yeah, so like that, all right? And I'm going to have the same thing going on in both sectors. However, it's going to be the case that the inward movement in the X sector is going to be smaller, right? Why is inward movement in the X sector going to be smaller? Because it uses less L labor, right? So even for a 20% reduction in input cost of L, right, that's a bigger reduction for the cost of the Y good than the X good, right? So now if I draw this new wage ratio, right, it's got to look, yes, something like that, okay? So several things have happened. So one is, notice, wages of both groups have risen, right? The fact that both of these points of intersection with the respective axes, right, have moved inward means that both groups are better off, both H and L, right? And of course that would be logical because the price of a good has fallen, right? And essentially in this model, your wages, your real wage is denominated in goods, right? So the amount, if you're a high skill worker, the amount of the X good you can buy, of the Y good you can buy for a given amount of labor has increased, right? Because now its price has fallen in your market, okay? But we've had more of it. But the L workers have benefited more, right? Because the technological change, which is what this is akin to, right, was concentrated in their sector, right? So what happens, right? Well, so both sectors will now actually substitute towards using more H labor. Why? Because this was an L conserving technological change, right? So per unit value, right, every sector will use less L labor. Now, of course, they're not using less of it. It's just they're using less of it domestically, right? They're actually using more of it internationally because beta is greater than 1, right? And so what happens? Well, we get WH goes up, WL goes up, WH over WL goes down, right? Meaning that wages rise differentially for low-skilled workers. We also get the following. I'm going to go back to my old terminology. I'll use this. Okay, so we'll have, so we'll have AHY, ALY, and AHX, ALX, right? These are both rising, right? So we're substituting towards high skill labor in both sectors, right? And finally, we're going to have output of Y, which we've just called Y. So we're going to have, so I'm going to say, well, all right, I'll just call it Y. So Y over X is going to have to go down, right? So we're going to be reducing relatively, Y is the, Y is the skill good. Sorry. Yeah, that's right. So that's right. Right. So Y is good. That's right. So right, we're going to this technological change is going to cause us to produce more of the low skill good, right, using more high skill labor. Okay? So think about this relative to Hong Kong, right? Think of Hong Kong's opening to China, right, in these terms. What's going on? Well, the sectors that are most low skill intensive, right, are the manufacturing sectors that are very labor intensive, right, that have a very high share of production relative to non-production workers. So what do? They ship off those tasks to mainland China, right? So their unit labor, their output will rise, their costs fall, they become relatively more skill intensive, right? And we have this substitution. So we have this phenomenon, which is exactly akin to the paper from Shea and Wu, right? Of within sectors, it looks like substitution towards the factor that's all of a sudden become exactly the opposite of what you would predict in the Hector-Olin model, right? Because normally the opening to low-skill, labor-intensive country would cause you to substitute towards low-skill labor in your domestic market, right? Because it would have depressed that price. But instead, what did you do? You just use that domestic labor, that foreign low-skill labor in another country that raised the productivity of your low-skill labor, which was complementary with that, right? And so then you're going to be substituting away from that labor towards high-skill labor, and every sector becomes more high-skill intensive, and everybody's wages rise, and they all go home happy. Right? Okay. Yes. Did I reverse that? Sorry. Oh, you're right. Absolutely, you're right. So right. So this would be yes. So that would be the opposite. You're absolutely right. That's right. Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. So before we sort of talk about whether or not that seems to ring true, I just want to make clear that you see the mechanism. Okay. So this is exactly akin to a kind of an exogenous unilateral technological change in the home country that unilaterally reduces its cost of producing low skill intensive objects, right? And so all of those gains accrue to that country because it's as if all of a sudden this country has better technology than the rest of the world, right? Because it has, beta times Ti W star less than, TIW, right? And so it's a little bit, so I want to make clear, it's a very rigged case, right? It's a very special case, right? Because one thing I haven't done here is I haven't allowed for any terms of trades effect. So imagine that, for example, Hong Kong is large relative to the rest of the world, right? Or at least its outputs in the goods in which it sells are an important share of the market, right? Well then as output of Y rises, i.e. the low skill intensive good, its price will fall, right? And that will tend to reduce the wages of L workers. Moreover, of course, we've also freed extra labor. So even, so we have sort of a double whammy. One, the output's rising just because of the labor conserving, the change in the shape of these iso cost curves. And then the other, we actually have the additional mechanical impact of rising I, so that raises Y even more, right? So that would push wages down further, right? So both of the sort of the general equilibrium effects in a world economy work against L labor in the setting, right? But the partial equilibrium effect, if you're a single country and you can basically reduce your labor costs by offshoring without changing world prices, right, then in theory all worker groups can benefit, okay? And so you can take this model, right, and you can map it back into the standard framework, and when you do, you arrive at a very funny case, right? But that's exactly the case that they're working through. Now, I think it's worth asking how appealing this set of assumptions is, and I think what may be least palatable about these assumptions is the perfect substitutability of laborers across tasks, right? So you could imagine that displacement of tasks through offshoring may have non-neutral impacts on workers at different, even among low-skilled workers. For example, if you say, okay, well, what tasks are offshored? Well, they might be the low-skilled tasks in manufacturing, but they're relatively high-skilled relative to other domestic uses of low-skilled labor, right? So it could very well be that when this, low-skilled labor is freed, right, it doesn't actually get to do something equally good or better, right? Its alternative use is less appealing. right? So it really matters for this very nice result to go through, or at least to go through in its purest form. It needs to be the case that even though these tasks are differentiated, right, in terms of from very routine to very non-routine, somehow workers of a given skill are equally good at all of them, right? And that may not be true, right? So I think that is the first part of this, that you might have some, you might, in terms of drawing a general lesson, saying, going home, telling your parents, don't worry about offshoring, it's good for everybody, right? You might want to caveat that point about perfect substitutability of workers across tasks. And then, of course, the other thing is, yeah?
Isn't that just, it could be substitutable up to some cost, some fixed cost of changing your, and that would be the discomfort that your parents are talking about.
Sure.
Political resistance is obvious.
Right. It could be that, right, for some fixed cost we could get you a better job, right, or an equally good job. Does that happen? I mean, the short answer, no, it doesn't ever happen. But even a longer answer, right, is can it be made to happen at a reasonable cost? And the answer is not obviously yes, right? All the the evidence on sort of job retraining and worker readjustment assistance, right, is not especially favorable, right? So we know that people displaced from good manufacturing jobs tend to lose wages and die younger, right? I mean, this is the work of Jacobson, Lovesland, and Sullivan, and more recently Till von Wachter and Daniel Sullivan, that basically shows that mass layoffs lead to early mortality, among other things. But possibly, right, and I guess another thing is, imagine there are non-traded sectors, right? Imagine, for example, the non-traded sector might be service work, right? Well, if you have if you have additional labor being displaced in service occupations, and those are non-traded, then their wages are not pinned down by the world price relation, right? And they can therefore actually experience real wage declines simply because of an influx of labor supply, right? So this model, so the very nice results come out of the case where all prices are pinned down by world trade, and moreover, all those prices aren't moved by your own internal actions, right? So I think I don't mean to be too negative. I think analytically this is very useful, right? And what's good about it is it provides you a way of modeling the sort of the dividing up of production processes without having to assume that you have, 3 sub-production functions and, as many sectors as you have production functions within each sector, right? So that's very messy. So I think this gets at the notion of taking a set of tasks, thinking about which ones you want to offshore, and thinking about how that might look in, within the standard model. So basically what they've done is they've taken a standard Heckscher-Ohlin model, and they put inside of it what you call a Ricardian comparative advantage model, right? And what the Ricardian comparative advantage model is basically, Heckscher-Ohlin models, which are really the standard trade models, are based on differences in endowments, right? So one country has more, land and one has more labor. One has more wine and one has more cloth, right? If you go back to the days when they were writing these models the first time. Whereas a Ricardian model is about differences in technology, right? It's about one country has a comparative advantage in making this, and one has a comparative advantage in making that. And it's not coming from endowments; it's coming from differences in skills or differences in the things they use to produce that. And this movement, this change in beta, is like a Ricardian model in the sense that you have a comparative advantage in non-routine tasks, right? And your degree of comparative advantage is essentially measured by beta, or beta times W star. And so as beta falls, that's equivalent to your comparative advantage improving, right? Because the world is getting cheap, can do these things for you cheaper and cheaper, so the things that you specialize in are therefore more and more valuable, right? So that's the kind of analytics of that model, right? And is this? So I don't know if this exactly gets at any particularly relevant case, but I think it provides a useful tool for thinking about this set of cases. Okay? Questions on that? Okay. All right. So let me now go forward a little bit, and I'm going to talk about. So I do one final caveat. Of course, the thing that is best about this model is it's a trade and task model, right? So since we're talking about tasks today, that's it's a good fit. And so now I want to talk about this paper by Lindsay Oldensky, who is a recent PhD student out of UC San Diego, and she's trying, and so the goal of her research, or this particular paper anyway, is to ask how do we understand differences in what industries export versus what they produce internationally, right? So if you're going to sell some good into a foreign market, you have two ways to do it, at least. One is that you can basically produce it at home, ship it. The alternative is that you can make it there, right? And you can set up your own plant, you can set up your own consulting firm, and so on, and produce it in that foreign country. And if you look in manufacturing, this is exports, and this is foreign direct investments, and you can see, and this is exports, this is foreign direct investment, right? This is the total. Maybe we should actually turn off that other overhead light. And so you can see that in manufacturing, it's about equally weighted between FDI and exports. This is for U.S. firms looking across, averaging across manufacturing industries. Okay. If you look in services, however, right, a much larger proportion of service exports is done through foreign direct investment rather than through producing the service and shipping it overseas, right? Say again? It makes, this is all very intuitive, but it's the case that basically the entire trade literature has been focused on trade and manufacturers, right? And it's kind of focused on productivity differences and so on, but it isn't focused on what is more or less difficult to transport or ship, right? So it's all, the assumption is you can produce a thing and then, you know, you suffer iceberg transportation costs, right? Some part of it melts away as you get there, right? And then, you know, the more productive firms choose to produce and so on, choose to export. So yeah.
This would include like the Subway sandwich shop, which is obviously FDI.
That's right.
US.
That's right.
Like a franchise.
Yeah, or it could, yeah, absolutely. So it include, but it doesn't have to, it could include like banking and accounting services, include computer programming services, right? And some of those things really can be exported. In some sense, you know, you can provide computer services for another corporation or another company from around the world, right? You don't have to produce it locally. So IBM has a choice about, you know, when it's, should it set up a shop in, you know, South Africa, or should it simply, you know, sell services into South Africa, for example. Okay, so I think the hypotheses here are, you know, quite intuitive, but nevertheless are worth looking at. So she says, okay, well, her three ideas are: one, that non-routine tasks are hard to outsource due to the complexity plus contracting, right? So it's hard to take a routine. Yes, go ahead.
I'm confused that it's outsourcing now, because FDI is quite different from outsourcing, because FDI means a whole product, but outsourcing being part of it. So what are we talking about now?
I guess I'm using the terms interchangeably, but if you prefer, we could call outsourcing FDI, right?
But you mean outsourcing a whole production process?
Well, so yeah, so that's correct in some sense, right? For her examples, it's really outsourcing the whole production process. When she's measuring FDI, she's basically you're making a direct investment in another nation to produce your good, right? So yes,
Offshoring, I think, would be a better word for it, right?
I guess, well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think many people would take offshoring to mean, you know, taking some piece of it. So I think FDI probably is the right term. Okay, so yeah. So let's say non-routine tasks or industries. So let's say again, industries that have outputs that are intensive in non-routine tasks, right, might have trouble doing FDI. Right, because it's complex enough that you're going to have difficulty supervising it or regulating it from afar, right? And that might be especially true if, for example, the country in which you want to export or do FDI into has kind of weak institutions for, you know, property rights and governance and so on. So contracting is difficult, right? Similarly, alternatively, right, communications intensive tasks, so things that, you know, tend to be done in person, right, are going to be difficult to produce locally, are going to be difficult to transport, right? Those are the things going to suffer the most significant quality deterioration along the way, right? So as a result of that, you may want to do FDI for that set of, if you have a product that's fairly communication intensive, it could be Subway sandwiches, but it could be consulting services, right? So if you're, the McKinsey Global Institute, right, you might set up shop in a number of countries to basically take your product right to the customer, right? Because you might think there'd be huge quality losses from doing that from afar. And then both of these things might be mediated by the quality of institutions and linguistic dissimilarity. So the quality of institutions, if you're doing FDI into a country that has good governance, good legal regulations, right, you can be relatively confident that if you set up your organization there, it may work like it works in your home country. Right? If, on the other hand, if basically the country requires lots of bribery, people are stealing stuff all over the place, you can't enforce contracts, right? Then you may be less enthusiastic about trying to, franchise your thing over there, right? So this would suggest that the quality of institutions is going to mediate. So for example, a non-routine task, you might be more reluctant to do FDI with it. But if the country into which you're selling has good institutions, that might offset it to some degree. Linguistic dissimilarity, right? So linguistic dissimilarity, if two countries are very dissimilar in terms of the languages, in terms of common languages, then in general, you would be more reluctant to take your non-routine tasks, right, and send them over there because you're going to have trouble communicating. However, for your language-intensive tasks, right, it's going to be more important to do FDI, right, because you won't be able to support that from your home country because of the linguistic differences, right? So that's the idea. And so what does she do? So what she does very simply is she takes, again, goes to the ONET, gets measures of non-routine task intensity, of communication task intensity, and then she looks across all industrial sectors in the United States, characterizes those industries by their communication task intensity, their non-routine task intensity, and then looks at the ratio of exports to FDI out of that industry into different countries, right? So the dependent variable here is the log ratio of exports to foreign direct investment. So when that's higher, it means you're exporting more, relatively more. When it's lower, it means that you're doing relatively more foreign direct investment. Right, so let me show you the average effect. So first of all, this is goods and this is services, right? And each one of these is a country-industry pair, right? So for example, this tax difference, linguistics difference in institutions, these refer to, right, the country into which you're exporting or doing FDI. Whereas these things like non-routine or communication or education, those refer to the characteristics of the industry in the domestic country, right? Okay, so what do you find? So first of all, non-routine intensive products, right? So this refers to the industry, so it's kind of it's not the occupation, but the overall average of non-routineness in that industry, right? If they're more non-routine, you have relatively more exports, relatively less FDI. If they're more communication intensive, right, just the opposite. Relatively less exports, relatively more FDI. This second column does the same thing for services, and what's actually kind of nice here is that these relationships, although the magnitudes are smaller, you at least get the same qualitative results, right? And in general, that's nice because it suggests that, well, maybe you could use the same set of hypotheses to explain the behavior of sectors that behave very differently, right? So that's good if these are consistent. And then these pool them. Right now, yeah, good. And consistent with the things I said a moment ago, countries that are more linguistically distant from the domestic economy, you're much more likely to export than do FDI. But on the other hand, if the institutions are poor, then you're relatively likely to do FDI. That's wrong. Okay, so that's not consistent with the hypothesis. But let me now go to sort of the main models, so here's a big table, and then I'm going to zoom in on it. Okay, good. So these are kind of the main models where she includes these interactions. So again, this is the same thing, goods, and services. And here, we're including, here's the non-routine measure, here's institutions times non-routine, and language times non-routine. So non-routine tasks more likely to be exported than done through FDI. However, if the institutional quality is good in the receiving country, you will do relatively more FDI, relatively less exporting. If the linguistic distance is high, right, you're going to have to do relatively more FDI, relatively less exporting. Here's the same thing for communication intensity. All else equal, communication intensive tasks are less likely to be exported, more likely to be done through FDI. If institutions are better, then it makes it relatively easy to export it rather than to do FDI. And if linguistic similarity is greater, it doesn't really show up, right? Okay. So that is kind of my skimpy review of the literature on tasks and outsourcing. But I would say it's a brand new literature. There really isn't a lot of authoritative material I've seen on this. This is the best thing that I've seen, right? But I guess I think the virtue of this work is, she's focusing on the characteristics of the product in some sense, or how it's produced. And the way she's doing that is she's taking occupations. Occupations are too complicated to work with, right, at the level of an industry. But if you can reduce the dimensionality to a few salient characteristics and use that to characterize the nature of production, then that may give you some reasonably plausible predictions about what things you would trade directly, what things you would want to outsource, right? And I think they accord very, very much with intuition, right, about what actually goes on. So, hopefully this will turn into a fruitful line of research more generally as another way of attacking this kind of, time-honored set of questions. Okay, so that's the end of that. Any questions on that? Okay, all right, so now we go till 4, is that correct? Okay, all right, so now you have a choice. So there are two things I could talk about, two things I'd be willing to talk about, only one of which I will talk about. So I will either talk about the paper by Desan and Santos about adaptive organizations, and this is about the organization of tasks within firms. How do you choose how narrow or broad to make jobs? Or alternatively, I can show this sort of age structure and task thing from the Otto and Dorn 2009 papers. So don't feel you have to vote for that one. But who would like to see the Desan and Santos paper? Okay, who would like to see the other paper? Okay. Other paper it is. So my lecture notes are on Desan and Santos are available. Okay. So this is the immigration stuff I'm also not talking about. Okay, great. Okay, so before I go into this, let me just tell you for a minute about the Desan and Santos paper. So, so let me just sort of say very briefly what their paper is about as a way of interesting you in it. Okay, so their paper is about the division of labor, and in particular, how broad or narrow should jobs be. And there's basically two classic lines of thought on the division of labor. So Adam Smith, right, famously visited the pin factory and said, gee, look how much more productive people are in making pins than they used to be. And the reason, he thought, was not because of technology, but because of finer and finer division of labor, right? And so instead of having one person going through all the stages of, shaping the metal and putting the head on the pin and, sharpening the point, you had finer and finer division where you had people specializing and there was gains from specialization, right? And so Smith said the limit to specialization is the extent of the market. That basically you can't have narrower and narrower jobs unless you're selling to more and more people, right? Because otherwise it wouldn't make sense for one person to just specialize in, filing the head of one specific type of pin unless you're going to be selling billions of them a year, right? So Smith said the extent of division of labor is determined. The division of labor is determined by the extent of the market. Now, so if you believe that, right, you would anticipate that in the over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, right, the extent of specialization would be getting greater and greater and greater because, of course, the extent of the market is broadening, right? Now, Becker and Murphy, in a paper in the JPE in the early 1990s, came out and said, actually, there's another limit on the extent of specialization, and this is coordination costs. That basically, if you, the narrower you make jobs, the more difficult it is for everybody to make sure that they're all in sync. Right? So, if you really have, 10,000 people in 10,000 separate rooms doing 10,000 separate subcomponents of the pin-making process, if there could be such a thing, right? There's some danger that they would get out of whack with one another, right? That one person would make, the head too big or too round or too square. I don't know what you could do with a pin. But anyway, and so they said, so coordination costs provide another break on the extent of specialization, because as you get finer and finer, eventually, they all have to be synthesized together and something could go wrong, right? Now, again, if you believe Becker and Murphy, right, you say, well, look, we're in this information-intensive era. It's incredibly easy to coordinate things, right? We have computers to tell us what to do, to, say, feed the monkey and so on. So, again, you would expect that jobs would be getting narrower and narrower, right, because the extent of the market is increasing and coordination costs are falling, right? But many, many people have the observation that actually jobs don't seem to be getting narrower, right? That actually people are being asked to do broader and broader sets of responsibilities, right? And so that is the puzzle that the Desan and Santos paper attempts to grapple with. And the observation that they make, and this is where I'm going to leave you with, is that there's another axis on which you might want to trade off, in addition to sort of gains from specialization, cost of coordination, and this is the gains from customization, i.e. to respond in real time to changes in your information set. Right? So in other words, you might be making a product and you might notice that fashion has changed. Or you might be cooking something and you might say, oh, this rice is slightly out of season, it's going to require more water or more time. Or you might be producing a mass-produced good, but actually your customer wants lots of variety. So you want to, like if you're making Mini Coopers, you want to have the British flag, and you want to have racing green, and you want to have different striped mirrors and so on. And so if you want to do that, you want to customize. Right? But when you customize, you kind of screw up the coordination among others. Right? And so given that, you might want to bundle tasks together to allow people more discretion so they can customize without imposing communication costs on others. Right? And so the point their paper makes is that as either the importance of customization rises or the extent of communication cost falls, one thing you could do is you could make jobs narrower and narrower, but another thing you could do is you could make jobs broader to take advantage of customization, right? But as you do that, you give people more discretion to take advantage of the falling communication costs, but as you do that, you may want to bundle more tasks in the same person, because we can assume that there's no communication cost within a given individual, right? So a given person doesn't have any cost of communicating with him or herself, right? So therefore, you might want to bundle at the person level. So their paper actually shows you and works out the kind of, pretty neatly, it's not a beautiful model, but it kind of works out the analytics of how you might set up this problem and think about it as a function of the importance of customization, the probability of successful communication, and also the sort of the amount of variance in the background environment that you might want to respond to. Obviously, you don't want to customize if things aren't changing much. On the other hand, if there's a lot of variance, a lot of information you might want to respond to locally, then you might want to give people a lot of discretion. So I think their paper is actually a very, very unusual and insightful effort to try to understand the widely held perception that the nature of work is changing, but not in the ways you might think, right? So, the feed the monkey jobs are one extreme, right? But many people, when you think about what does a contemporary clerical worker do, as we talked about earlier today, right? They don't just do typing and filing, right? They have very broad jobs, right? If you look at people who are selling products, selling insurance, or selling, custom kitchens or something, they don't just say, oh, I can sell you this thing, but not the other thing, right? They provide an array of services. Those reflect a broadening of jobs. Okay, so let me leave that behind, but I do recommend that paper to you highly. Okay, so last few minutes. This is a very straightforward paper, so this won't take long. Okay, so the purpose of this paper was to ask, where do middle skill workers go? Right? And this is something that's come up repeatedly during the discussion today of, well, if these occupations are in decline, what happens to the workers who are in them? And how is that accommodated? And as I said, initially we wanted to do that using panel data, but we concluded we didn't have anything suitable. So we decided to attack it using cross-sections. And we started with a very simple idea, which is that workers are going to develop some type of occupation-specific human capital as they age. So the more time you're in an occupation, the better you become at it, hopefully. So when an occupation goes into decline, what's going to happen? Well, first of all, firms are going to stop hiring, so you won't have new younger workers entering. Second of all, the workers who are the incumbents who've been there the longest have the greatest incentive to want to stay, right? So they don't lose specific human capital, right? So if that's true, when occupations start to contract or go into decline, they will get old, right? In other words, the average age in those occupations will tend to rise, right? And this is really, I have to say, I credit this idea to David Dorn, and it turns out that actually that's remarkably true, more so than we would have predicted based on what we believed. Okay, so for example, this goes back to, here's your skill percentile ranked by occupational median wage. This is the change in age, in average age in occupation between 1980 and 2005 in US data, right? So you can see, first of all, the mean occupation is increasing in age by about 2.5 to 3 years over that time, right? This is reflecting, all industrialized economies, the population's getting old, right? That's just a function of, the baby boom cohorts are now on the other side of the median, right? Okay, but however, that aging is much, much more pronounced in the middle of the distribution than it is at either of the tails. So in particular, the lowest skilled jobs don't appear to be getting older at all, maybe because they only employ teenagers, maybe because there's a lot of immigrants in those jobs, and even relatively high skilled jobs are not getting old as fast as the rest of the economy, suggesting there's young, high educated people entering them. Okay. And obviously, and this just goes back, here's the change in employment share, here's the change in mean age. You can see these are mirror images of one another. Okay, so the first thing you might just do in the regression version of this figure is you might just regress the change in mean age, change in occupation share of total employment. This is just an occupation level regression in aggregate with whatever 330 data points, and you can see mean age falls when the occupation grows. And how does that happen? Well, young workers enter, prime age workers leave a little bit, and older workers are relatively flat. Okay, so now that's the kind of proof of concept. But then, so the way we wanted to apply this more broadly is we said, okay, we're going to use a geographic analysis, and we're going to look at occupations as we've done earlier, measuring them by what we call their routine task intensity, which is just the ratio of routine to manual task, right? So as I point out, occupations that are very high in this measure are things like clerical workers and accountants and solderers, if you remember that table of the 10 occupations before. Okay, and then we're going to, okay, so good. So first of all, so just to show you, right, again, this is the same cross-sectional regression, right? Here's the routine intensity of an occupation in 1980, right? Here's the change in mean age, right? So what you again see, right, that routine intensive occupations, those are the ones in the middle of the distribution, are getting old, right? You're not surprised by that, right, because you know exactly all the correlations among these variables, but that's what we'd expect. Okay, so what do? Well, so we divide the U.S. labor market into 722 distinct commuting zones. Commuting zones are groups of counties in which most people live and work within the same cluster of counties, right? So you can think of them as being geographically semi-distinct labor markets, at least in the sense that there isn't too much labor migration in the short run out of the county, like so people don't go work in the next county if the wage rises immediately. Okay, we rank each occupation by its routine task intensity, and we just take the most routine intensive 1/3 of occupations, and we call these our routine intensive occupations. You could do this lots and lots of ways. You could use a continuous measure. It actually doesn't matter. The ranking is very, very stable, and so it's not sensitive. We just do this for transparency. We just say, here are the top 1/3 in terms of routine intensive occupations, and then for each commuting zone, we calculate the share of employment in 1980 that is in routine intensive occupations. So obviously the mean of that variable in 1980 is 1/3, right? But it varies across commuting zones. So in particular, commuting zones that are these are metropolitan areas in commuting zones, they're very high in routine intensive employment are New York City, Washington, San Francisco, Detroit, and Chicago. Commuting zones with the smallest routine employment shares are Pittsburgh, San Antonio, New Orleans, Tampa, and Syracuse. So just what does this show you, or what is that coming from? These are obviously these routine intensive metropolitan areas, right? These are highly educated areas. The reason they're routine intensive is these routine occupations in some sense are the kind of service occupations to the professions, right? A lot of these are clerical and accounting and automation work that, right, is an input into the production process of highly educated workers in finance, in medicine, in law, and so on, right? Okay, so our expectation is that if a commuting zone is concentrated in routine intensive occupations in 1980, that's like having all your money in a stock that's about to, lose value, right? So in other words, they're specialized in a set of activities that are going to be facing declining demand over the next 25 years simply because we know, ex post, not ex ante, right, that a lot of that work is going to be automated. So it's not necessarily bad news for those areas per se, right, but it's bad news for those occupations. And so, in San Francisco, we're going to expect to lose a lot of routine workers, and in San Antonio, we're expecting to lose relatively few just because there aren't that many to start with, right? Okay. So we're going to look at the relationship between the initial routine employment share and the change in routine employment, and then we're going to do that by age and education, right? And our expectation is, first of all, commuting zones that are initially specialized in routine occupations will see a differential decline in these occupations over the next 25 years. That's unsurprising and somewhat mechanical. The other is that the magnitude of this decline is going to differ by age, right? That the decline in routine employment is going to be the largest for the young and the smallest for the old, right? Because the older workers are going to tend to stay within those occupations. The young workers, as they flow into the labor market, are going to move into these expanding occupations. So the first part of this, I guess we're done.
Sorry, we have put this book.
Oh, okay. Okay, so we're just about to stop. Okay, so and then the second part of this will actually look at where they go. Okay, so apologize for going over. All right, so the okay, so this is do we have a couple minutes or no?
So I told them that we finish up in about 4 minutes.
Great, perfect. Okay, good. So this is the initial share of routine intensive occupations, right? It goes from 0.2 to 0.4 with a mean of 0.33. This is the change in routine employment share among non-college workers over the next 25 years. And each one of these points is a commuting zone. Great, so you can see, and this is not surprising, right, that places that are high in this variable initially see a big decline. That wouldn't have been true, by the way, over the 1960 to 1980 period. It's true in this period because we know those occupations are falling altogether. Incidentally, here is the same thing. This is for non-college and college, right? It's much more pronounced for the non-college workers, and that's because non-college workers in routine occupations are very likely the ones doing the repetitive labor, right? Okay, just want to be clear. All right, so here's the first thing to look at. So here's the initial share of routine occupations. Here is the routine employment share by age and education group. So if we look at all age levels, right, the decline in routine employment is largest among the young, and then somewhat smaller, about 1/3 smaller among prime age and older workers. If we look among college-educated workers, right, the slope is more modest, but again, it's most pronounced among the young. If we look at non-college workers, right, the slope is much steeper, but again, it's more pronounced among the young than the old, right? So just as you would expect, right, it's this change in occupational mix is occurring because older workers are tending to retain employment in these routine occupations, at least in relative terms, and younger workers are not moving into them, right? They're moving to something else. And if you were to do this, for example, here's by age, here's by age and here's by education, right? You can see among the college workers these effects are less pronounced, and in all cases the effects are larger among the young than among the old. So then you might ask, where do they go, right? So where do these workers go? Now let me make it clear, we're not following the same workers over time. We're looking at people of the same age at different times, right? So we're saying compare the employment of people aged 16 to 25 in 1980 to the employment of people 16 to 25 in 2005 and ask how their occupational structure differs across places, right? So this is not a cohort analysis. And so again, we do, and I already went through this fortunately, where we just divide the non-routine occupations into two groups, the high wage and low wage based on their mean wage in 1980, right? And so again, these high-wage non-routine occupations, these are skilled occupations. Many of them are college educated, right? These are on the right-hand tail distribution. And these are relatively low-skilled, non-college educated. These are on the left-hand tail distribution. And so you can ask, where do workers go as a function of age and education as these routine occupations go into decline? Well, a couple things. First of all, if you look for the older workers, right, those who leave I'm going to use that term loosely, right, move into low-skill non-routine occupations. For younger workers, right, some move into low-skill non-routine, some move into high-skill non-routines, right? So that would suggest that the older workers who are in fact displaced from routine occupations end up shifting leftward, right? They move downward in the occupational distribution. If you do this for If you do this for college workers, right, you can see that the young, it's almost exclusively rightward shifts, right? So young college workers, what are they doing? They're going to the right-hand tail of the occupation distribution. For middle age, it's kind of half and half. For older, it's all down, right? So older college workers, downward occupational mobility. And then, of course, if you look at non-college workers, right, it's all down, right? We just go left. So. And actually, that's the end of the paper. So, so what I wanted you to take away from that, I think is just a very simple descriptive exercise as a way of getting a handle on, as occupations go in and out of demand, how do people adjust? And it's clear that it's going to matter where you are in your career and also what human capital you have. And the best thing you can be in this paper is a young college worker, right? And the least favorable thing is to be a worker displaced from a routine job who doesn't have a lot of portable skills, right? And that's exactly consistent with the notion that you're going to have this downward mobility. So I said before, I tried to emphasize, it's not skill, it's not education per se, it's ability at different tasks. When workers are displaced from the middle, their skills are much more applicable to the left, right, into manual activities than they are to the right, moving into higher wage professional and technical jobs. So I think that's just a very rough cut of the data, but maybe a useful descriptive exercise. Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak.